Attention! By decree of the Lord of Holy Terror and by extension the God Emperor of Mankind, queries into the recorded archives you are requesting are strictly prohibited. By querying such information of a prohibited nature is tantamount to heresy. As an act to such, it is an account and the God Emperor is a free and edict. You are thusly a heretic. As a convicted heretic, you are in violation of the following. Article 1073P, DAC 977864/211/.
So, no shit, there we were, hovering over a camouflaged Xenotech shuttle carrying more firepower than any three of our birds, and instead of running away, or trying to destroy it before it realized we were there, we were trying to figure out how to steal it. The long warp voyage out to this backwater sector must have rotted our brains. Aside from how stupidly dangerous an idea this was, it had absolutely nothing to do with why we come out here in the first place. In the station below us, the other two teams had just engaged the Heretic forces in an effort to take a captive and figure out why they were here. In space above us, two incredibly dangerous ships were locked in a brutal dogfight while our own completely combat incapable ship nervously watched from the sidelines. Somewhere across the Immaterium, an unknown archaeotech device was cutting a swath of destruction towards Imperial space, and yet our primary concern was nicking this fancy-looking Xenos shuttle, possibly while its owners were busy shooting up our companions. Truly, we were the pinnacle of inquisitional professionalism. It really wasn't our fault, though. The tech priests were obviously to blame. If they hadn't been plotting to maroon us in space, we wouldn't have felt nearly so motivated to acquire alternate means of transportation. When you combine that sort of threat with the opportunity offered by an incredibly valuable unattended vehicle, heretical Xenotech though it may be, it's entirely unreasonable to expect a poor guardsman to resist temptation. Secure in the knowledge that our behavior was completely and totally justified, we prepped our breaching tools and formed up in our shuttle's airlock. Twitch provided some cutting charges, which were carefully placed using the drone's little servo arms. When everything was in place, Jim, who'd eventually stop trying to convince us to do something saner, flew us as close as he could without alarming any hostile shuttles. A trio of his little skulls were deployed and leashed like sled dogs. Then he departed us in drifting in space above the holographically disguised shuttle. All things considered, it was a very good thing that Twitch was up to date on his meds and Fumble wasn't feeling particularly nervous. The skulls hauled us across the gap as, just outside of our line of sight, the charges went off and the shuttle bays depressurized. As the last breath of air leaked out, our 5-man, 1-woman team zipped in. We crossed into the grav field and landed inside the shuttle with our weapons ready, just like the trained professionals we supposedly were. Well, at least 5 of us did. Whether it was due to her injured hand or because she wasn't used to performing these sorts of shenanigans, Amy missed her mark and wound up careening off the hull. Everyone turned to watch as she spun off into space, swearing up a blue streak as the skulls raced out to catch her. All of us were so distracted that we were nearly pushed out after her when a gust of wind suddenly hit us in the back. Our squad turned around expecting to see, then shoot some effeminate Xenos. Instead, a pair of big scarecrow-looking things with fish-shaped heads were standing there staring at us. At least we thought they were staring at us. The damn things didn't have eyes. Their weapons were certainly pointed our way, though, which is what really mattered. Fighting in a vacuum is odd. Nothing sounds right. You can feel and sort of hear your weapons firing through your arms, but The shots don't make a sound. It's amazing how much you rely on little audio cues in battle. It was hard as hell to tell how many shots we were firing, and even harder if they were even hitting. Oddly, it was almost as if we'd lost exactly 10% of our ballistic skills due to the unfamiliar terrain. We coped though, and poured a torrent of las and plasma fire into the two hostiles. Surprisingly, the fish-headed Xenos didn't seem too bothered by our barrage. They just soaked up our fire and slowly tracked their weapons onto us. Then everything went funny. Not haha funny, rather, whoa, I can taste the color purple with my eyes funny. As the feeling washed over us, we scattered, and a pair of large orbs appeared. One orb formed right between Twitch and Sarge, while the other appeared right above the now prone form of Nubby. For a split second, we could see something beyond understanding, but not horror in the spheres. Then, with a pop we could somehow hear through the vacuum, the orbs disappeared and took two perfectly circular chunks of bulkhead with them. We all just stood there and stared for a second. Then Fumble started screaming. None of us had liked what we'd seen when the Xenos had fired their weapons. Whatever those things did looked a lot worse than just getting shot, but Fumbles had a stronger reaction than the rest of us. The little psyker screaming reached to a shriek, then kept going until it started bouncing around inside our heads. Now, there are several relatively normal things that are a bad idea to do in a void suit. Vomiting, traditionally, heads the list, followed by crying, sneezing, and a few other things depending on whether your model has a waste disposal system. Anyways, if someone revises the list, using Psychic Shriek should probably be added somewhere near the top. Now, not being a psyker, I can't properly say whether it was a matter of the shout building up inside his helmet until something gave, or if it was just punched through his faceplate on the way towards its target. Either way, though, we all felt a wave of panic roll over us as the shriek was cut off by what sounded like a burst of wind. A helmet's worth of air and a hail of plastic slammed into the two Xenos monstrosities along with the psychic attack, where their combined force did exactly jack shit. Fumbles landed on his ass, frantically clawing at his ruined helmet and radiating pants-wetting terror to the entire squad. Unlike our past experience with the Psyker's aura, this wasn't distracting, annoying, or disturbing. This was incapacitating. By all rights, we should have died there, stumbling around in an attempt to escape a sourceless fear, but two things saved us. The first thing was Twitch, who shrugged off the aura of fear like it was nothing. He sprinted across the room to Fumbles, pulling his explosives-filled pack on the way. He jammed the bag over the Psyker's head and pulled its drawstrings, causing the bag to inflate like an incredibly dangerous balloon. The aura of terror reduced to an intensity as Fumbles' inability to draw breath was replaced by a claustrophobic darkness and the fact that someone was partially strangling him. The second thing was that the fish-headed Xenos were some sort of retarded. One of them fired a shot at Twitch as the trooper sprinted across the bay and missed it by a small margin. The other casually walked to the open hole in the bay and just sort of vacantly stared out of it. It didn't stop to shoot anyone on the way, or even try to step on Nubby, who was lying half a meter away where it was stopped. It just definitely one of the more bizarre things we'd seen on a battlefield. Or it would have if we'd been in any condition to see anything. As the aura faded, we acclimated to the unusual feelings of someone else's terror raging through our minds. Everyone got to their feet. We were greeted by the sight of one Xenos readying his insanity orb cannon for another shot, and the other spacing out the edge of the hole we'd entered through. This is where your normal group of heroic badasses would have opened fire in an effort to kill the Xenos before they could fire again. We didn't even try that. See, our attacks, plasma and hotshot lasgun alike, hadn't so much as phased these assholes. It was time to try something new. Sarge shouted his orders and threw himself at the Xenos cannon, grabbing on like a big disgruntled monkey hanging from a branch. To Sarge's dismay, the fish head turned out to be more than strong enough to hold up him and the weapon. Luckily, the way Sarge was flailing around completely spoiled the Xenos aim, and the next hell orb appeared in the middle of the bay floor. While Sarge kept his target off our backs, the rest of us turned to the one near the hole. Tink and Twitch stepped backwards, lowered their heads, and charged straight at the Xenos' back. Down to the floor, Nubby hastily crawled towards the hostile, then flipped onto his back. At this point, the fish head seemed to remember that it was in a middle of a battle and started to turn to face us. He wasn't fast enough, though. Two charging guardsmen hit the Xenos in the side at the same moment as a pair of augmetic legs lurched upwards. As body checks went, they weren't the best. Both soldiers were on the wiry side, and the best word to describe the Xenos' size and weight is hulking. Combined with the lifting force of Nubby's legs, though, it was just enough. In a sort of slow-motion ballet, the fish-headed tumbled forwards. Right out the hole, we blasted into the bay walls. Amy was being hauled back towards the shuttle by Jim Skulls and Spot, who she was riding like some sort of demented horse. As she neared the hole, something big and rather confused-looking launched out of it, causing her to swear and nearly fall off her mount. After she regained her composure, she watched as the thing tumbled into the void, slowly spinning as it drifted away. When it didn't do anything, she dismissed it as not her problem, and raised her new rifle as the shuttle's interior came finally into view. Back inside the bay, the Xenos had gotten tired of Sarge dangling off its weapon. They grabbed one of the struggling non-com's arms in its dinner plate-sized hand and inexorably pried him off its weapon. Sarge found himself suspended in the air, or vacuum as it were, facing away from the angry Xenos. He flailed as hard as he could in an attempt to break its grip and failed miserably. Sarge then grabbed his slung lasgun and tried to fire over his shoulder. It was wrenched from his hand before he got a single burst off. Finally, in desperation, he reached for his grenades, which were pretty high on the list of stupid weapons to use in a vacuum. Perhaps, luckily, he wasn't able to grab one before his free arm was grabbed by the Xenos' other hand. It raised him in the air, slowly, inexorably began to spread his arms, and by extension, Sarge's, apart. The first thing Amy saw as she rose over the edge of the hole was Fumbles, sitting there and clawing at a backpack full of high explosives tied over his head. This was odd, but not an immediate problem. The second thing, or things, were three of her squad mates running around like idiots screaming about not being able to get a clear shot. The third thing was her new boss being pulled apart like a wishbone by a 3-meter-tall Xenos. Amy sighted her rifle, waited a beat for Sarge's legs to swing out of the way, and put a burst of plasma right through the monstrosity's shoulder. In a perfect universe, the fish head's arm would have fallen off. Then Sarge would have beaten around its head and neck with its own severed limb. Unfortunately, in our reality, the arm just went limp, while his hand still retained its vice-like grip on Sarge. Also, both of Sarge's shoulders were dislocated, and he was too busy screaming to beat anyone around with anything. We tried not to let our disappointment show, as Sarge merely flopped to the side to let us have a clear shot at the Xenos. 3 hot-shot lasguns, a plasma gun, and a pulse rifle poured precise fire into the Xenos' midsection. The combined weight of fire did what our earlier barrage couldn't, and with a soundless snap, the bastard collapsed in two separate pieces. Sarge swore loudly as he landed and informed everyone that the Xenos' grip was not getting any looser. Since the fish head seemed rather hard to kill, most things lose their spunk after being cut in half, you know. Everyone stepped forward and concentrated their fire on his shoulders. That finally did the trick, and we pulled Sarge free. It took a while to pry the severed arms off his wrists, though. Talk about a death grip. We all stood there, contemplating our success and wondering what to do about Sarge's soldiers when Fumbles finally caught our attention. His comms wasn't functional and we couldn't hear him, but he managed to send a rough psychic image out. He was wondering if the fight was over and we could go somewhere with air now. The bag was nice and all, but he was pretty sure at least one of the mines in there was armed. Twitch winced. Then he and Tink got to work on the door that the two fish heads had come through. They had to push the Xeno's severed torso out of the way to get access. It didn't do anything when Tink kicked it, but it somehow managed to glare reproachfully despite not having eyes. Or a real face, to that matter. While the more technical side of our team got the door open, Jim's Metaskull floated in and took a look at Sarge. It sort of poked around in a confused manner, probably trying to figure out how to get at Sarge's shoulders. After a while, its little machine spirit must have reached a decision, because it deployed a syringe and tried to jab Sarge with it. The puncture-proof void suit turned out to be stronger than the skull expected. After a bit of straining, it broke the needle and whacked into Sarge's shoulder, triggering an impressive amount of cursing. The Metaskull got even more agitated at this failure and deployed its little circular saw, the one we'd last seen it used to decapitate the Magos. None of us really knew if it had decided to harvest Sarge's head or just wanted to cut through the void suit while he was in a vacuum so it could deliver its painkiller shot. Either way, Nubby and Amy fended the skull off with the butts of their weapons until the door was finally open. Jim was very apologetic about the whole thing, but we still didn't let the skull follow us into the pressurized section of the shuttle. Once the door was closed and Twitch had carefully removed the bag full of explosive from Fumble's head, we looked around our new shuttle. The room where we'd fought the fish heads had just been a moderately roomy troop compartment. Nothing interesting in there. But this room was definitely some sort of command center. It wasn't filled with Vox units, cogitators, or random uninsulated wires like an Imperial command center, but the hollow thingy displaying a map of the station in the middle of the room was a dead giveaway. Despite its tasteful decor and abundant air supply, the command room made us uneasy. It had a short hallway leading to the shuttle's cockpit, but none of us saw any hatches connecting to the station. In fact, the only exit we'd seen was the one in the rear, and it hadn't been connected to anything. The question of how the Xenos had gotten aboard the station and which direction they'd be coming from if they felt the need to take the shuttle back hung in the air like a wet fart in the tank, hard to ignore, and holding the potential to become a serious problem. From the elegant but rather uncomfortable chair he'd found near the map, Sarge reminded everyone about how the Xenos were supposed to use teleportating webs to get around. A brief search of the shuttle didn't show up anything that looked like a teleportarium or was particularly web-shaped. The closest we'd got was a Xenos rune that looked sort of like a spider. Twitch put a mine on it, just to be safe. Then put a mine on everything else, just to be safer. None of us stopped him. It really was the only defensive option we can think of. While Twitch saw to the perimeter, Tank got to work on figuring out how to fly our new piece of loot. Amy checked in with the other teams, and Nubby called Doc for some medical advice. Sarge later complained bitterly about how many tries it had taken to relocate his shoulders. But neither Nubby nor Fumbles had any medical training, and there was a lot of distortion on the comms channel. Anyways, The way they kept yelling, it was very distracting, and the second one only took 2 tries, so all his whining really wasn't justified. After a little medical procedure was finished, a quick council of war was held. Amy reported that the other teams were just killing a lot of servitors and not making any real progress towards finding useful intel. Jim followed that up with a report that the tech priest hadn't given any new orders, but claimed they were very interested in our shuttle. Based on all that, Sarge's vague plan was for us to call off the station part of the mission before anyone did anything crazy and fly the Eldar shuttle back to the occurrence border. From there, the Adepts and possibly the Cogboys could search it for clues or whatever. The only real problem was this plan was that compared to Imperial or Tau systems for that matter, Eldar tech was almost impossible to understand. Tink was working hard and kept claiming that he'd nearly figured it out, but so far he'd only managed to turn the lights on and off. While Tink tinkered and occasionally asked for advice from Jim or Old Bill, the rest of us kept busy. Amy watched the perimeter with Twitch, Sarge poked at the holomap, and Nubby and Bumbles were assigned prisoner duty. Prisoner in this case meaning the severed Xenos torso. They taped the thing to a wall and, at Twitch's request, drew a face on its blank head so it didn't look so creepy. At Nubby's urging, Bumbles was adding some embellishments to their artwork, when a section of the wall slid outward and a tall, Lilith and familiar-looking Xenos appeared out of thin air. The Eldar Warlock scanned the room, then began to say something. He was immediately interrupted by Twitch shouting that a hostile had breached the perimeter and was raising his lasgun. The Xenos tried to resume speaking, only to be interrupted again as Twitch asked for permission to fire. Sarge, who'd nodded off, jerked awake, just in time to hear the frustrated Eldar snap.
Foolish Mankai, you cannot shoot me. I am a hawk.
Then Twitch got tired of waiting and opened up on full auto. There are times when an Inquisitional agent, military commander, or Imperial diplomat will negotiate with one of the hated Xenos and discover they really aren't all that bad. Then they wind up working together to fight some common foe, and a sort of polite but distant working relationship based on mutual respect is formed. This was not one of those times. It took the Warlock about 5 tries to finish saying hologram. Twitch kept shooting him every time he started talking. When the demolition trooper finally ran out of ammo, the incredibly frustrated Eldar exploded into a lecture on how holograms worked and why it was pointless to shoot them. He was interrupted halfway through as Nubby shot him, turned to Sarge and reported that, quote,
"The Xenos appears to be some sort of hologram. I don't think we can shoot him."
The Eldar swore in its fancy language and asked Sarge to control his quote-unquote ape creature, whereupon Twitch finished reloading and shot him again, while Nubby loudly told Sarge that the Xenos was getting pissy. Things only went downhill from there. The Warlock was an arrogant bastard. He tried to order us around, but none of us had even the slightest intentions of returning to our wretched vessel or leaving matters beyond our comprehension to our betters. The diplomatic breakdown was total. On our side of the table, Amy had a serious axe to grind. Nubby was just Nubby. Sarge's soldiers hurt like a bitch, and everyone else just didn't give a shit. As for the Warlock, he loudly declared us to be idiot children playing with deadly weapons, both personally and as a race. The Eldar had probably intended to either use his moral superiority to get us to leave his ship, or cut some sort of deal with us. The problem was that he kept getting bogged down in pointless arguments, petty insults, and fits of frustrated anger. Everyone, even Fumbles, was doing something that might as well have been scientifically designed to outrage the prissy Xenos. To start with, Tink didn't even try to hide the fact that he was stealing the Eldar shuttle, and occasionally asked him what a specific button did. Amy only spoke when she thought of something particularly scathing to say, and while Twitch eventually stopped shooting the hologram, he'd occasionally interrupt the Warlock to insert his own rather unique theories into the conversation. Fumbles was admittedly acting on Nubby's orders, doodling on the captive fishhead Xenos. This caused a surprising amount of anger in the Warlock, despite how good the mustache and monocle he drew looked. All that was relatively minor compared to Nubby and Sarge, though. Nubby, for reasons beyond all logic, had appointed himself as the Warlock's translator. He shouted down or shot the holographic Xenos at the end of almost every sentence, then relayed his personal interpretation to Sarge. Our fearless leader took an evil delight in how much this annoyed the Eldar, and started only responding to Nubby's translations. It was childish, antagonistic, incredibly unprofessional, and all according to a plan so devious that none of us even realized we were a part of it. Well, at least Sarge claimed it was his plan afterwards, and no one was in any position to argue with the results. In his most cunning of minds, Sarge figured out that the Warlock had us incredibly outclassed when it came to diplomacy. The only person on our team that stood even a chance of holding their own was the old diplomat Ada, back on the ship. But with the Cogboys monitoring the comms, bringing him in was out of the question. Therefore, the only way we could possibly come out ahead in negotiations with an Eldar, who probably had hundreds of years of experience talking circles around Inquisitors and the like, was to drag him down to our level. Now, the brilliance of Sarge's plan didn't end there. In addition to keeping the Eldar off balance, the behavior of the more eccentric members of our squad acted as a time-buying distraction for both Tink and the other teams. Every second the Warlock spent screaming at us in incoherent rage was a second where he wasn't leading an attack on our shuttle or sniping anyone in the station. Admittedly, neither group was actually accomplishing anything useful with that time. Tink had found 13 different controls for the shuttle's lights, and last we heard from the other teams, they were still killing endless waves of servitor, but they didn't have it. The incredibly uncivilized discussion eventually rolled around to how stupid humanity's fascination with Archaeotech was. Our race's suicidal persistence in trying to keep the current peace from its owners was going to wind up gutting the entire sector's ability to fight off the next wave of Tyranids. On top of that, if we somehow managed to keep it, we'd inevitably wind up destroying ourselves with it. Any sane race would have let the Necrons have it, or at least drop it on some orc or Tyranid world that no one would miss. Sarge perked up at this piece of actual useful information. Then, when Nubby suggested his cunning new idea to drop the Archaeotech on some orc or Tyranid world that no one would miss, Sarge agreed that that was a good one. The Eldar paused mid-rant to boggle. The incredulous Warlock asked if we were serious. Sensing that the time was right, Sarge told Nubby to shut up and promised that we were super serious. We didn't want to use the Archaeotech, we didn't want to study the Archaeotech, and we certainly didn't want to fight the Necrons, Emperor help us, for the Archaeotech. As far as we were concerned, the metal bastards could just have the thing. The Eldar sputtered, then asked about 15 different questions, most of which he answered himself. We were obviously too stupid to lie, and must have already known what the Archaeotech was. Otherwise, how did we know to come to this system? Furthermore, despite our appearance and behavior, we were obviously the ones in charge of this mission. After all, our team was the one in his shuttle as opposed to fighting servitors on the station. No one corrected these assumptions. The only real question the Eldar had for us was why we wanted the Archaeotech destroyed. According to him, the 5 other Inquisitors and Magi he'd encountered, then killed, had all lusted over the device like it was mankind's salvation. Sarge nonchalantly suggested that we were just smarter than them. The Warlock shot a pointed look at Nubby, who had a finger jammed up to his second joint in his nostrils, then back to Sarge. Our fearless leader shrugged and adjusted to less ambitious than them. Before anyone else could say anything to push the Warlock back from confused to furious, Sarge made his move. He pointed out that we'd only wanted to prevent any more plans from being wiped out. We agreed with the Eldar. The Archaeotech either needed to be destroyed, turned over to the Necrons, or sent out of Imperial space. So he should just tell us where it was going next, and we'd handle the rest. There would be no working together bullshit. We'd leave as soon as we had our directions, and he'd never have to talk to us again. The Warlock started to say something, then stopped, then started again, then stopped again. Finally, he let out a very frustrated sigh and gave us directions to an Imperial world whose governor had just purchased the Archaeotech. The Eldar then told us to get off his shuttle before he ordered his ship to disengage and let the heretics have the system, data records and all. Sarge took a second to ponder this last part of the deal, then asked Tink how things were going. From up in the cockpit, Tink announced, for the 20th time, that he'd figured out the controls and would be able to fly us away before anyone could stop us. He triumphantly pressed a few buttons, flipped a switch, and manually connected 2 wires. Once again, the shuttle completely failed to move, and the lights flickered off, then back on. Sarge told the Warlock he could have his shuttle back. Twitch packed up his toys, Fumble was given a less dangerous pack to use as a helmet, Tink was forcefully pulled out of the cockpit, and Nubby was told to empty his pockets. While everyone else packed up, Sarge and Amy debated the whole tech priest problem. It was eventually decided that there was no way to really hide the Archaeotech's location from them. Luckily, Amy was able to suggest a way to keep the Cogboys on our side for the time being. Jim was called to pick us up, and over the monitor channel, Sarge reported the location of the Archaeotech. He also warned everyone that a sizable heretic fleet was being gathered to seize it before the Mechanicus could confiscate it, so maybe we should try to get there and secure it first. It wasn't very subtle, but hey, neither were we. And the Cogboys must have bought it because everyone's shuttle picked them up without any arguing or ultimatums. Everyone was feeling pretty happy about how the mission had went as we left the Eldar shuttle. In a fit of goodwill, Tink even pushed the fish head's limbs into a neat pile and left a note saying which way the second one had been drifting when we last seen it. As Jim and Hannah flew us back to the occurrence border, we looked back at the station we'd never gotten around to boarding. It was looking rather ragged. Its interior probably hadn't been designed to survive pitched fights involving anti-armor energy weapon, and the star behind it had gotten noticeably larger. We congratulated ourselves on not being stupid enough to board that death trap and watch the station shrink behind us. Right as it was getting too small to see anymore, there was a neat little firework display. We couldn't be sure, but the explosions seemed to match the locations of all the heretic shuttles. That probably explained what the Eldar had been up to. Our mood lasted until Jim landed us onto the occurrence border's main shuttle bay. We were the last team back, and the bay was a madhouse of rushing people and horrible screams. Doc and his girlfriend were running around with their medical team. From the looks of it, they had quite a few customers, and Sarge detailed a few of us to lend a hand. Surprisingly, most of the screams weren't coming from Doc's patients. What had at first looked and sounded like a field surgery station turned into something weirder. Half a dozen of the senior cogboys were clustered together in the far corner of the bay. As we watched a captive heretic was brought off the shuttle by some servitors and dragged to the group of tech priests. There were some very unsettling power tool noises and a lot more screams, and Sarge asked Jim and Hannah what was going on. The two engine seers whispered to each other for a while, then said the tech priests were checking the captive for serial numbers. Apparently, they could be used to determine which cabal the heretic had come from. From there, the tech priests would research past records of the sort of technology the heretic had access to, giving us a major advantage when it came to a fight of their fleet. Sarge pondered the fact that there wasn't actually a heretic fleet. He then weighed that against how the screams seemed to indicate that the cogboys didn't believe in a little thing called sedation or killing people before dissecting them. In the end, he decided that it was not his problem and he really needed a drink, or at least some painkillers for his shoulders. Better yet, a drink and some painkillers and someone to take his void suit off without him having to move his arms. In the end, he had to settle with just the painkillers. Everything else had to wait until after he'd talked to the captain, adepts, other interrogators, and whoever the tech priest sent to vaguely threaten everyone. Sarge returned to our quarters hours later, looking like shit and still wearing his void suit. Our first few tries to remove his suit resulted in a lot of yelling and Nubby getting punted across the room. In the end, Tink wound up just cutting him out while Amy held a bottle of liquor with a straw in it for him. The gist of the situation was that the Eldar ship had disengaged and vanished after the heretic shuttles had been destroyed. The heretic ship hadn't tried to chase us or catch up with the falling station. Instead, it just warped out shortly after the fight ended. The captain couldn't be sure, but it didn't look like it was heading in the same direction as us, and the scanners had been clear since we'd entered the warp ourselves. We were headed towards the coordinates the Eldar had given us, which had turned out to be the planet with the shifty governor Sword Guide had wanted us to go to. Sarge said that the interrogator had been rather bitter over the whole thing, mostly on the account of how he'd been shot in the gut twice during the station fight. Battleaxe wasn't in great shape either. They'd shed a lot of blood fighting off the servitors and capturing two heretics for interrogation. The tensions were rather high due to the way the tech priests had seized those hard-won prisoners and vivisected them. The cogboys were not very apologetic for this, but at least they'd share their own info on the particular group of heretics with the rest of us. The adepts were chewing through it and would put together some combat plans and stuff like that during the trip. The other info Sarge had relayed from the Warlock hadn't gone over well. To start with, everyone but the tech priest had given Sarge grief for not getting the actual details of the Archaeotech from the Eldar. He very politely told everyone they could just shove their complaints, then moved on to the matter of who was probably purging planets. The revelation that it was the Necrons chasing the Archaeotech, or at least that's the Eldar said it was the Necrons, had quieted everyone down. While it had been the smart bet at the pull ever since we'd learned about it was a piece of Archaeotech, having it confirmed was fairly unpleasant. None of the other teams had fought them before, but between their training and the stories everyone had heard, they didn't need us to tell them that the Necrons were bad news. The captain had reiterated his suggestion that we go somewhere safe and request an entire fleet's worth of backup. Most of us thought that sounded like a great idea. Unfortunately, Sarge and the other interrogators thought otherwise. They believed that if they got there fast enough, they could do something to prevent the Necron from wiping out the planet and keep the heretic fleet, which Sarge now regretted making up, from getting the Archaeotech. Of course, the exact details of what'd been done was still a bit fuzzy. The interrogator's only good idea was to either destroy the Archaeotech or put it somewhere where the Necrons could just take it without killing everyone. The tech priest had informed everyone that both options would result in their grisly deaths. The most they'd allow would be for us to set up a perimeter around the Archaeotech and plant a bomb which the ship head tech priest would build and hold their only detonator for. All the interrogators, even Sarge, had wound up agreeing to this. The captain called them idiots, and since Sarge wasn't in any condition to hit us at the moment, we all agreed. The one saving grace of the interrogators' plan was that, being on the border and all, the planet we were headed towards had a fair-sized PDF and SDF. Between that and the detailed intel we could provide, there was a slim chance we could hold off the Necrons until reinforcements arrived, or the tech priests stopped being assholes. Emphasis on slim. Once again, we were stuck traveling through the warp and hoping like hell we'd arrive before everything went plane-shaped. At least this time we had a better idea of what was currently happening in our destination. The planet had a branch of a telepathica, and our astropath was able to keep tabs on their situation. The adepts and the other teams spent a lot of time sending messages back and forth, looking for clues about where the Architect was and all that. We didn't trouble ourselves with any of that. Someone would tell us if they found anything important. For the time being, we had other stuff to do. Aside from the usual planning bullshit that Sarge had to put up with, we were able to dedicate our full efforts in some very important projects. Okay, well, one important project, a less important minor one, and a bit of entrepreneuring. The less important one was replacing Sarge's las gun. When the Xenos, which the adepts had told us was called a Wraith Guard, not a fishhead, had disarmed him, it bent his las gun like a banana. Since fruit-shaped weapons tend not to work well, and Amy's pulse rifle had performed so awesomely, Tink put all his effort into converting a Tau carbine for Sarge's use. Everyone else was moderately jealous. The other side project was, of course, Nubby's continual quest not to lose quite a lot of money on the betting pool. Fumbles had revealed to the rest of us that during our last bit of travel time, they tracked down the only 3 who'd bet on Necrons, then persuaded them to retract those bets. All that was left to do was convince the ship quartermaster, who was the only one actually holding the money and tracking the bets, to allow the withdrawal. Once that was done, there was no winning bets, and the money would surely default back to everyone. We left Nubby to his little plot, which seemed to revolve around getting some incriminating pictures of the quartermaster. We'd be getting our money back too, after all. So aside from all that little stuff, all our efforts was put into the big important project. Operation Screw Everyone Else Over Before They Screw Us. Now, this may sound like the default state we operate in, but this was a much more considered effort than our usual paranoia and misanthropy. Our focus was almost entirely on 2 parties, the tech priests and the warlock. Now, it's obvious why we felt we needed a plot against the cogboys, with them acting nuttier than a squirrel shit and all, but the Eldar part might need some explanation. See, it is the very nature of Eldar to dick honest, hard-working guardsmen over. They probably tell each other stories of the great Eldar hero who used his magical Xenos powers to absolutely nothing but being a colossal dick. Based on this singular concrete fact about this basic nature, we knew that the Warlock would A. Show up at the planet, B. Try to use us to destroy the Archaeotech, and C. Proceed to dick us over as hard as he possibly could the second that we were no longer of use. There may be a lot to infer from a single piece of racism, but it was backed up by our personal experience with the Warlock. When we'd needed talking with him over the holo what's-it, we'd gotten the distinct impression that he didn't like us for some reason. That was a sure sign of a dickish personality. Anyways, the project was mostly prep work, and the first step was securing allies. Jim and Hannah had been decent to us, but the whole thing about possibly following orders and leaving us to die was bad and needed fixing. To that end, both Jim and Hannah were invited down to our quarters, then locked in and treated to a class on ethics by our resident expert, Nubby. Don't laugh. This wasn't a class on any of those sissy do unto others as you would have them do unto you ethics. This was a class in Guardsmen ethics, which tend to only go as far as do unto others. And Nubby knew those by heart. He and Doc, as you might call the friendliest of the most persuasive members of our little group, were assigned to the ever-loyal fumbles in teaching camaraderie 101 to Jim and Hannah. The junior tech priests were educated in why it's important to stick with your mates, when and when not to follow the rules and regs, why you should never trust anyone over the rank of sergeant. They also got a special bonus course on why killing your close personal friends because of a crazy priest told you to do so is a very bad thing. By the end, both engineers were thinking like proper guardsmen and gave us the vital information we needed for the rest of our project. Specifically how the tech priests would probably monitor us, what sort of bomb they'd be giving us to plant, and where it and its detonator were being built. From there, it was Twitch and Tink's show. Twitch was far too excited about his part of the plan. Not because he got to blow up people who annoyed him. Sarge vetoed mining the tech priest's quarters on the account that he still wanted to have a ship after the mission, but because he got to play with the biggest bomb he'd ever seen. Now, when I say the biggest, I don't mean size. I mean its yield. The first time Twitch made his way through the vents to where the priests were putting the bomb together, he wound up needing a new pair of pants. They were giving us a backpack nuke. It's been said, mostly by guardsmen, that the final step to becoming a full tech priest involves having the common sense of your brain pulled out and replaced with a little box of screws. In our opinion, the fact that they were giving us a nuclear weapon pretty much proved that. Of course, they thought they'd be the ones controlling it. They probably were snickering to each other about how frustrated and scared we'd be, not being able to set off the bomb after planting it, and not knowing if they'd remotely detonate it while we were still in the blast radius. Still, though, it was titanically bad idea. I mean, even ignoring how much trouble we were able to cause with conventional explosives, we had a demolition expert and what could be loosely called a technical expert in our squad. The second we were out of their line of sight, we were going to crack that puppy open and rewire the detonator. So, Tink and Twitch spent their time spying on the bomb's construction and planning on how they'd rewire and jam the Cogboy's bugs. Meanwhile, the job of putting together a plan to screw over the Eldar fell to Amy and Doc. Largely because they were willing to do what the rest of us were not. Sit through tedious lectures on xenopsychology from the adepts. Unfortunately, we didn't know exactly what the Warlock was going to do, only that dickishness would eventually be involved. This meant that Doc and Amy could only come up with sort of general plans, but they were still doing a very good job of it. A bunch of contingencies were prepared for. A few simple strategies were mapped out and practiced by our entire team, and Amy came up with a rather nasty idea of forcing the Warlock to behave if we ever saw him in person. Doc quietly told the rest of us that he was glad not to be the evil mastermind this time around, and recommended that we never antagonize the Markswoman. When we finally came out of warp at the border world, we felt ready for anything. Unfortunately, it turned out that the other teams and adepts weren't nearly as awesome as us. Not only had they failed to pin down the location of the Archaeotech for us, they'd also been unable to confirm that it was even in the system. Sure, a quarter of them had died fighting on the station, and half of the survivors were still being tended to by Doc and his girl, and they'd been only able to do their research via discreet astropathic questioning and a few out-of-date field reports. Still, though, we'd expected better from them. I mean, a little professionalism and work ethic isn't much to ask for, is it? It was going to be so damn embarrassing if it turned out that the Eldar had been lying to us. We sat on the ship a few days, twiddling our thumbs and getting more and more worried while the other teams went down and made some discreet inquiries. Sarge and the Adepts helped them out, but the rest of us pretty much stayed in orbit and waited for the word go. Luckily, from our perspective, they met with enough resistance from the local government and AdMech priesthood to practically prove the Archaeotech was there somewhere. Probably the only reason that no one had tried to kill our investigators was the constant stream of ships pouring into the system at our request for reinforcements. Most of them were little navigator-less armed merchantmen, but there were a few escort-class vessels, and the captain said that our odds in a naval battle were definitely looking up. Still, though, from what we overheard, the locals were some seriously uncooperative people. No one wanted to admit to anything, even when the interrogators started flashing their junior rosettes around. That changed abruptly when every astropath and navigator in the system reported a fleet approaching through the warp. While the incoming fleet was great for our investigation, it was also rather confusing. The only thing that anyone knew for certain about how Necrons got their ships around was that they didn't use the warp. Of course, everyone else said it was the Heretic fleet, but we knew better and spent a lot of time pondering what was actually coming. Honestly, it got very annoying telling everyone it wouldn't be a Heretic fleet, then not being able to say why. Sarge finally snapped during one final big meeting and just told everyone that he made the fleet up to keep the tech priests in line. There was a lot of arguing and shouting after that, but luckily no mass servitor uprising. Of course, about 5 minutes after he said that, a large group of what was unmistakably heretic vessels came out of the warp and demanded the surrendering of all technology within the system. Everyone was too busy for recrimination, but the captain did spare a few seconds to congratulate Sarge on being a psychic. With the arrival of the Heretic fleet, everything started happening at once. Sword Guide, who'd still been too injured to help much in combat, transferred over to the largest friendly ship in the system and started organizing and took overall command of the fleet that we'd been cobbling together. Armed with the intel provided by our ship's priests about the Heretics' probable armaments and strategy, he was confident that he could keep the hostile fleet away from the planet for at least a day or two. Down on the planet, BattleAxe, who'd been leading the investigation, was approached by several local nobles who had a change of heart. The planet's nobles sold out their governor and put their forces at BattleAxe's command. The basic story they gave us was the planetary governor had purchased the piece of Archaeotech and a deep scientist from a rogue trader. The device itself wasn't going to be used for anything, and they didn't actually know what it was, but the technology being reverse engineered from it was supposed to turn their little SDF fleet into the most powerful space force this side of Battlefleet Ultima. They were patriots, see? It had all been for the good of their world, and by extension, the Imperium. The governor had told them all within 5 years they'd be completely secured against any Tau aggression and Tyranid splinter fleets. In 10, their shipyards would be the envy of every Forge world. In 20, they'd personally control all space shipping from here to the Damocles Gulf. And by the end of the century, the Administrative would need to make a whole new sector just to contain the worlds they'd use their fleet to colonize and take back from the Tau. Quite the statement, but every tech priest and veteran Guardsmen they'd sent to look at the thing had confirmed it. So they all signed on, even knowing that some Xeno forces was chasing the Archaeotech and would need to be fought off. They were confident in the size of their defense forces, they said. All the other worlds had been wiped out were little undefended backwaters, they said. It was worth the gamble, they said. But now that they've seen the size of the Heretech fleet and the Inquisition was at their door, they were singing a different tune. Up in our shuttle, we were listening to the whole spiel as we dropped towards the manufactorum they'd fingered. Everyone but Jim and Hannah, who were locked in the cockpit and keeping to themselves, speculated on just what sort of super weapon they'd found. If it really was such a big game changer, it'd be a shame to just blow it up to little radioactive pieces. We were still going to do it, of course, aside from the whole thing where it was a heretical piece of archaeotech with the potential to drive the Mechanicus into a schism. You can't carry a nuke all the way down to a planet and not set it off. It's just not allowed. Anyways, as we went to go blow up the archaeotech, Battle-Axe had organized a coup. She and her half-strength team would handle capturing the planetary governor and securing a temporary government with the help of most of the Knobs regiments. She wasn't going to hog all the support troops, though. A sizable force had been stationed near the manufactorum where the archaeotech was located, and she set them to lend us a hand. Well, actually, it was more the case of us lending them a hand. They had a lot less travel time than us, and we saw nothing wrong with letting them handle most of the grunt work. So our little 8-man force came down outside the manufactorum after several hundred PDF yahoos had spent about an hour shooting the place all to hell. That may have not been quite as professional as lending some sort of high-precision strike force, but the important thing is that the place was clear and none of us had gotten shot in the process. Whole lot of PDF had, though. The place was a mess. But that's what happens when you're dumb enough to try to rush a fortified positions. Poor dumb guard wannabes. As per our orders, the PDF stayed out of the semi-secret basement where the archaeotech was located. They just swept the upper building, which had been defended by a few governor's men, as well as a surprisingly large number of servitors. The servitors worried us at first, since the Heretech weren't supposed to be anywhere near close enough for shuttle or teleport to force down. Thankfully, when Jim and Hannah came over and took a look, they said the servitors didn't have any recognizable Heretech markings. That was a load off our minds, and we followed some PDF general over to the basement entrance. Surprisingly, Jim and Hannah both tagged along instead of returning to their shuttle. Sarge weighs the pros and cons of having two cogboys around when we went to blow up some piece of really cool tech, then decided to trust them. The engine seers fell in behind Twitch, who was lugging a rather heavy backpack containing a large metal cylinder with an unnecessary amount of ornamentation on its surface. The bomb didn't have any exterior controls, readouts, or anything aside from what Jim had told us were etchings of holy scenes and prayers written in binary. It looked more like a drum for storing holy water more than anything, and it was about the right size and weight. We had to scrounge a grab plate and clamp it to the bottom for anyone but Sarge to be able to carry the thing. Presumably the whole reason the bomb's odd design was that there were no exposed controls for us to muck around with, and no way to see inside. It should have stopped anyone who wasn't entirely suicidal from trying to go in and rewire the detonator, but Twitch had the thing cut open in 10 minutes of our shuttle departure. Now the nuke's top was held together with duct tape, and its remote control was hooked up to a novelty noisemaker, and the only way to set it off was using the detonator Sarge was carrying. After a rather unpleasant walk through a corpse-filled building, we reached the entrance to the underground lab where the archaeotech was stored. We stood around the intimidating entrance for a while, wondering just what sort of defenses were waiting for us down there and if it wouldn't harm to send a few squads of PDF down first. Our little debate was interrupted by a call from the captain, who warned us that the fleet engagement had started and that, inexplicably, all astropathic communications were being blocked. Jim blanched at hearing that second part. He told the rest of us that the heretics didn't have any way to do that. The Necrons were here. Confirmation arrived in the form of a few dozen green lightning storms outside of the windows. They weren't violent enough for an orbital bombardment and faded quickly, but they left behind some very ominous glowing clouds. Tink went over to a window and ratcheted up the zoom on his goggles, and then went pale and recommended that we go blow up the Archaeotech right now. There wasn't time to fool around with sending scouts down there, and anyways, the PDF would need all the men that they had for a fight of millions of metal insects that just teleported into the atmosphere. We didn't need telling twice and practically sprinted into the basement, only stopping to advise the PDF general to conserve ammo and save his last round for himself. Twitch and Fumbles went first to check for traps and ambushes. Sarge tried to take the nuke from Twitch before he took point, but the demolitions expert flatly refused. He claimed that the bomb was his now, and he'd be damned if anyone take it away from him. Anyways, he said it wasn't getting in his way and actually helped him concentrate. Just carrying it made him feel all warm and fuzzy inside, he said. The rest of us thought that sounded like it was leaking radiation, but didn't push the issue. Aside from a few traps, which Twitch easily disarmed, the stairs weren't defended by anyone. Either they'd all fought and died on the surface, or they'd fallen back to the big room at the bottom of the stairs. We'd all bet on the latter and formed up to breach the final door. The charge went off, flashes were tossed, and we all rushed in with weapons raised. Then we all sheepishly walked down an empty hallway that was actually the final door, and did it all again. This time, the hail of las fire poured at us as we scrambled to find cover in a very large room. Luckily, in addition to being very large, the room was littered with all sorts of conduits, machinery, and inexplicably chest-high walls. Through a combination of luck and skill, we all managed to find something solid to hide behind and started trading fire with what looked to be 5 tech priests. Originally, we'd had some vague plan that Tink would find where in the room the Archaeotech was, and Twitch would plant the bomb while the rest of us held off the defenders. But that didn't turn out to be necessary. For one thing, it was easy to see where the Archaeotech was. A massive opaque shield took up the rear half of the room. For another, the tech priests didn't need to be held off. They were pathetic. These guys weren't anything like the sort of mechanical combat monstrosities we had expected. They were just relatively normal tech priests with las pistols. They'd hold up behind some ineffective cover, and we picked them off one by one, while Jim and Hannah made some half-hearted attempt to negotiate their surrender. There was just one tech priest left, and we were arguing over whether to try to take him alive so we can deactivate the shield. Then we all heard a metal stomping sound and something that looked like a cross between a dreadnought, a necron, and a metal squid came around the edge of the shield. That description doesn't really do the metal monstrosity justice. Start by imagining a dreadnought made of the weird metal that Tau used for everything. You know, the tan stuff. Now replace its arms with a pair of those green tube Necron weapons, the kind that shoot the lightning that evaporates whatever it hits. Finally, imagine that instead of having an armored plate protecting the dead hero of the Imperium, it has its whirling ball of mechanandrites, and somewhere in the middle is a crazy tech priest screaming in binary. We were so incredibly screwed, it was almost funny. We'd been expecting something worse than a few schmucks with las pistols, but for once our cynicism and paranoia had been insufficient. We all just stared for a second as the thing stomped towards us. Almost absent-mindedly, Amy headshot the last wimpy tech priest. Then green tubes started charging up and Sarge screamed at everyone to pop smoke and scatter. Cover wasn't going to do shit against those Necron beams. As the room filled with smoke, the beams started lancing out and leaving big empty gouges in the floor. Operating pretty much independently, everyone started readying their anti-armor equipment they had. Sarge started the show by peeking through the edge of the smoke. Noticing he was behind the dreadnought, and activating the special rangefinder dealie on his totally not a Tau pulse carbine. To everyone but Tink's surprise, it worked perfectly. He and Amy suddenly had the location of the dreadnought displayed on their goggles and scope respectively. 2 balls of plasma, one big and fat, the other small and fast, flew out of the smoke. They both hit the dreadnought in the mass of mechanandrites that passed for its torso, but only managed to burn a few of the tentacles off. The dreadnought aimed down the gaps in the smoke the shots had left and returned fire. Tink was away before his shot even hit, but Amy wasn't as quick and her world went green. None of us were in the position to see what happened, but Amy screamed like a stuck grox and flooded the comms channel with an incredible stream of curses. We took that as a sign that she'd live and concentrated on the fight. Not having fancy targeting toys, Nubby and Tink had to find gaps in the smoke and make their attacks. Nubby hung back and put some well-aimed last shots into the dreadnought, causing it to stomp towards him, while Twitch darted forward with the depth pack. Sarge groaned when he saw Twitch sprint out of the smoke with the nuke still strapped to his back, then nearly had a heart attack when one of the dreadnought's weapons swiveled towards the demolition trooper. Thinking quick, he activated his auxiliary grenade launcher and fired a Tau flash grenade between Twitch and the dreadnought. The dreadnought's beam missed Twitch's nuclear backpack by centimeters, and the blinded trooper slammed helmet first into one of its legs. Now stunned as well as blind, Twitch staggered around for a second, then suddenly disappeared as Fumbles stuck his head out of the smoke. The dreadnought stomped around for a second trying to find Twitch, but quickly gave up and returned to chasing Nubby as another hail of last shots hit it. Sarge confirmed that Twitch was still alive, then ran off into the smoke to emulate Nubby's hit-and-run harassment. While everyone else was running and shooting, Tink sat still and waited for his plasma gun to recharge. As he waited, he noticed Sarge wasn't marking the target anymore and sent Spot out to keep an eye on things. Thanks to the drone's vid feed, he was the first to notice that the dreadnought was slowing down a little. Initially, he put it down to some sort of battle damage, but then he spotted the familiar-looking skulls flying above the smoke. And as he watched, one of them darted down and attached itself next to 2 others on the dreadnought's back, causing it to slow down a little more. Jim and Hannah's skulls saved all our lives as we pulled ourselves back together. None of us were sure exactly what they were doing, and the engine seers seemed too busy to explain, but the dreadnought got slower and more inaccurate with each passing second. Everyone stayed back and peppered it with las and plasma, forcing it to consistently stomp around hunting for us. It was looking like we'd be able to wear the thing down, especially once Amy was back up into the fight. Then, the tech priest caught on. He let out an incredibly pissed-sounding scream, and his mechanandrites started ripping the skulls off his back. He caught on to our only real trick, but he was distracted. It was time to do or die. Twitch shared some of his det packs with Sarge, Bumbles cloaked both of them, and they ran in. It probably would have worked, but it wound up not having to. When the sprinters were halfway to the dreadnought, its mechandrites started bursting apart with little flashes of light. A few seconds later, the flashes were followed by a very familiar las cannon beam and one of those hell orbs. Finally, a blast of raw psychic energy came out of the smoke and slammed right into the middle of the dreadnought's tentacle face. That was apparently the thing's limit. It let out a sound like a blender with rocks in it, powered down, and toppled backwards. The warlock swept out of the smoke with his 2 wraith guards in tow. The one with the weird hail gun set about methodically sucking pieces of the dreadnought into the warp, while the other didn't quite aim its last cannon at us. The warlock walked up to Sarge, congratulated him on holding out for as long, and then apologized for not arriving sooner. He'd had important matters to take care of. Sarge didn't deck the smug bastard, but it was a near thing. Given that the warlock was here in person and a pair of wraith guards with him, we were much more polite this time. Sarge made an attempt at diplomatic small talk while the rest of us formed up and took stock. Mostly we were bruised, exhausted, and low on ammo. Amy was the only one of us who'd taken an actual hit. When Jim and Hannah helped her through the smoke, conversation stopped for a second as everyone stared. Her hair and helmet had been given what you might call a reverse mohawk. The Necron beam had been a millimeter from taking the top of her head off. Everyone quickly found something else to look at, specifically the other figures coming through the smoke. The Warlock Ranger were practically dragging two short figures. One we all recognized as a Tau Earthcast, and the other looked like a monkey that someone had been testing augmetics on. The Tau was frantic, and when he saw us, started babbling at us in Gothic. He had been kidnapped, which is illegal, then enslaved, which is doubly illegal, then forced to work with all sorts of mentally unstable people, and now he was kidnapped again, and he just wanted to go home. Sarge digested all this for a second, then shot a confused look at the Warlock. He said the Tau was the last of the Archaeotech science team, and ordered him to deactivate the shield. We all followed the Tau scientist to the cogitator station, listening to a steady stream of complaints along the way. The monkey remained silent, but tried to bite the ranger holding it a few times. Once at the station, the Tau pressed a few buttons and asked Sarge to flip a heavy-looking lever. The shield vanished with a loud crack and revealed an Archaeotech that caused all this trouble. Jim and Hannah fell to their knees in awe, while everyone else stared. Nubby swore loudly. Twitch started laughing, and Sarge facepalmed. Tink peeked out from the back of the group and turned to Amy.
Looks like a Necron ship. How the hell did they get that?
We checked just to be sure. There was a slim possibility that somebody else had gotten their hands on a damaged Necron vessel. It didn't have to be the one we gave to the rogue trader in exchange for some fire support. The whole entire bloody mess, from the empty worlds to the damned heretic fleet above us, didn't have to be the result of us cutting a quick deal to save our skins. This didn't have to be our fault. It was, of course. We could see the spot where we melted our way in, and the words, "Nubby was here," glared damningly at us from inside the ship's open door. This was probably going to go down in some inquisitional history book as the most colossal screw-up ever performed by a bunch of low-level grunts. I mean, cults and traitors typically have to work for years to achieve this sort of mess. We managed to achieve it in just a few minutes of panicked bargaining. Oak, or maybe even the Lord Inquisitor himself, was going to nail our ears to the wall and peel our skins off with a dull spoon over this. Assuming we survived the current mess, that is. Amy, Tink, and the rest of the team caught on to what was going on in a few seconds. They'd heard the stories more than a few times. The Eldar didn't get it, though, and just stared at us as we all alternated between swears, moans, and hysterical laughter. Eventually, the Warlock got frustrated and trying to piece things together and demanded an explanation from Sarge. Our fearless leader was obviously not thinking clearly, because in a fit of retardation, he told the Xenos the truth. And oh boy, was he pissed. The lecture we got was a nice preview of the one we'd inevitably get when we made our end of mission report. The word incompetent was used at least 30 times, and it was amazing how many synonyms for idiot the Warlock could think up. It was quite embarrassing, but the sheer grating annoyance of being lectured by the smug Xenos bastard eventually brought us back to reality. The lecture ended with a wail of, "Do you know how much time and life you've wasted with your stupidity?" Which Sarge sourly countered with, "Oh, shut up. We're guardsmen. Wasting time and life is practically in our job description." While the Warlock searched for more words to express his outrage, Sarge ordered the rest of us to secure the ship and asked the Warlock what his plans for sorting all this out was. Sarge and the Eldar argued over whether the Heretics and Necrons would leave the system if we just blew the ship up. While they did this, the rest of us took the Tau prisoner and inspected the ship. They had changed a lot since last we seen it. The place was practically filled with things that looked like a hybrid of Tau and Imperial tech. Jim and Hannah snapped out of their religious daze they'd been in, and after a bit of outrage about how heretical everything was, started asking the terrified scientists questions. Playing tour guide seemed to calm the town down immensely. He led the tech priests around the ship, with Tink tagging along and asking annoying questions. They were given a completely incomprehensible summary of how the scientists had merged Tau, Imperial, and Jericho tech into something that could interface with the Necron systems. Supposedly, that let them reverse engineer pieces of the tech and make their own versions or something. It was pretty much impossible to follow. While the nerds babbled about what this is the greatest scientific advancement in centuries, Twitch and Nubby went to find a place and plant the nuke and blow it all up. There's probably something deep and philosophical you could say about that, but we're Guardsmen. We had a really big bomb, and damned if we weren't going to use it. Twitch slid the actual go boom part out of the bomb of its decorative cylinder and crammed it into an out-of-the-way crevasse. He was literally vibrating with excitement as he taped the thing into place and armed it. Outside, Amy and Fumbles watched Sarge's back as he brainstormed with the Eldar and, over a secure comm link with Jim and Hannah had rigged, the Adepts. It was a rather tense situation, especially when the senior tech priest started repeatedly trying to call Sarge's main comm. Luckily, everything stayed subcritical and a plan was formed. The ship was to be destroyed, of course, as the facility and any notes. The problem was that neither the Necrons nor the Heretics were likely to leave the system until they'd checked the planet over themselves. Since that checking would doubtlessly involve the death by scarab swarm or demonic machines of everyone on the planet, that wasn't an ideal solution. For a while, they toyed with the idea of taking the ship, which the scientists had gotten flying and running. The theory was that the Necrons and Heretics would follow it and leave the planet alone. But the Eldar pointed out that the vessel wasn't more capable and the Necrons would catch anything that wasn't. Really, the only way to save the planet was to somehow stall the attackers until reinforcements arrived, or get them to fight each other. To this end, Sarge suggested just giving the ship to the Heretics with the experimental Tau tech on it mined, but the nuke left out. This would be vetoed by the Warlock as well as Jim and Hannah. Finally, after a little debate, an even more suicidal plan was agreed upon. The ship would be flown between the Heretic fleet and the region of space where the Eldar said the Necrons were hiding. When both fleets closed on their prize, the ship's teleportation jammers would be dropped, and the Necrons would be forced to kill all the Heretics in case they ported something off the ship. If, somehow, the Heretics looked like they'd win, the nuke would be detonated. The only questions left were who would detonate the nuke, who would crew the ship, and what would happen to the crew when the teleportation jammer went down. The Warlock promised that if we crew the ship with the Tau scientist, his vessel would follow us at maximum teleportation range. The jammer would go down, and we'd arm the mines, and then we'd pour off and he'd carry us to safety on the only ship in the system fast and stealthy enough to survive the ensuing melee. For trust reasons, the nuke's detonator would be left in our hands, but also put a timer in case something went wrong. Sarge eventually agreed. Everyone sprang into action. The nerdier members of the team went back aboard with the Tau scientist to prep the ship for its last flight. The Warlock ordered his men to rig their own charges in the lab. Then, the second the Tau scientist was out of sight, and without any slight hesitation, decapitated the captive automatic monkey. Amy put in a courtesy call to the PDF upstairs, who were surprisingly still alive, telling them to bug out if they could. Finally, Sarge called the captain and the other two interrogators to fill them in on the plan. The tech priest must have been listening in too, because the little noisemaker we had on the remote nuke detonator hooked up went off halfway through the conversation. Sarge called the Cog Boys assholes and promised everyone else it would work out. He then got a final sit rep from the rest of us and walked over to where the Eldar was cleaning his sword. Sarge gave the Xenos his best parade ground salute, then thanked him for agreeing to teleport us out of the ship. The burly non-com held out his hand, and after an awkward pause, the Warlock sheathed his sword and took it. Looking Sarge right in the eyes and saying it was the least he could do, the Xenos shook his hand. Inside that stupid helmet, he was probably grinning ear to ear about how clever he was and how the annoying Guardsmen would finally get what they had coming. Imagine how the Xenos bastard's expression must have changed when Sarge's grip tightened and dragged him forward. The final stage of Operation Screw Everyone Else Over Before They Screw Us was beautiful. Sarge and the Warlock both staggered backwards as Nubby darted forwards, and Tink pulled a lever. Before any of the other Xenos could do a thing, the ship's shield sprang back up and cut them off from their leader. The Warlock's sword hand was locked in Sarge's grip, but his eyes started glowing and sparks appeared around his offhand. This was interrupted by a sticky-sounding thunk as Nubby slapped a jetpack onto his chest, right over a shiny-looking gem that sat in the middle of his armor. The Xenos went stock still, hypnotized by either the blinking light on the charge or the way Nubby was waving a dead man's detonator over his head, cackling. Sarge released the Warlock's hand, stepped backwards, and formally welcomed him to the ship's crew. He managed to get through the whole speech without cracking a smile, but behind him, Amy and Nubby were grinning wide enough to swallow an entire sewer's worth of shit. He wrapped up the speech with a little warning of what would happen if anything cut the comm connection to the jetpack detonator, then advised the Xenos to come aboard and start arranging our exit strategy. The Eldar glared at everyone for a while, then stalked onto the ship while swearing and promising vengeance under his breath. Sarge clapped him on the back with a hearty, "That's the spirit, son," and followed him in. So no shit, there we were, on a Necron ship being piloted by a terrified Tau scientist, flying out to start a fight between a heretic fleet and a Necron extermination force, with our only chance of survival resting on an Eldar warlock who'd we taken hostage by gluing a jetpack to his spirit gem. Gotta say this for the life of the Inquisition, it may be absolutely insane, but it makes for some great stories. Our flight up to orbit was less interesting than you'd think. We didn't have any windows to see the massive swarm of Necron scarabs we'd been flying through. Mostly we ran around placing all the Twitch's jetpacks and helping the Tau keep all the jury-rigged systems running. The little guy was terrified to the point of gibbering about the situation, and Fumbles was put on duty behind him, pumping a constant stream of positive mental energy or whatever. Sarge took the detonator from Nubby and hung out with Amy and the Warlock and ironed out the last pieces of the plan, like when the Imperial fleet would disengage and how the teleporting would actually work. The Eldar seemed to have accepted that all he had to do to get out of the situation in one piece was not be a dick. This was probably very hard for him, dickishness being the nature of an Eldar and all, but aside from being a little surly, he was coping. In fact, spirits were high all around after Fumbles calmed the Tau down. The only people who seemed to be unsure about the plan were Jim, Hannah, and Tink. The techies were all rather torn by the way we were about to destroy a technological marvel, and the fact that the Eldar flatly refused to allow the Tau to live. The Warlock held that the fact that we felt sorry for him was immaterial. He would have to stay and keep flying evasively while we ported out. A mine would be placed on his seat to ensure he didn't fall into enemy hands. Sarge pointedly ignored the mutinous looks and whispering this statement generated. It took an amazingly short amount of time to reach the edge of the fleet engagement. Necron ships were ludicrously fast. As we edged around the Imperial fleet, some final preparations were made. There was going to be a brief period of time between the ship's teleportation jammer went down and when the Eldar vessel would be able to get us out of there, because science or something. That meant that we had to ford up together on a fancy pad thingy and hold whatever off ported in and then activate the mines and nuke timer right as we ported out. So barricades were constructed and lines of fires were cleared while Sarge went over to the ship's big box station and opened up a general channel. Sarge loudly, jovially even, announced that the Archaeotech was right here and the Heretic could bloody well have it if they could catch him. He panned the vid feed around a little. Then, to really sell things, walked over to the Tau scientist and asked him to say hi to the crazy metal men, both groups of them. The Tau let out a short, high-pitched wheezing sound and tried to slap the recorder away. Sarge laughed and reminded everyone that this was the last surviving scientist that had been studying the ship. This was a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity, folks. Then cut the feed, but left the transmitter on so everyone could find us. We were all watching on the ship's holo thingy, and it was surreal how the Heretic fleet shifted. Every single vessel turned as one, ignoring the Imperial ships and burning towards us at maximum speed. Simultaneously, a section of empty space on our opposite side filled with little moon-shaped ships, and a larger one that looked sort of like a fork. They were further away, but started closing the gap with incredible speed. All of us had been laughing at Sarge's little speech, went silent, and watched as they closed on us like two sets of teeth. Keeping the balance between the two incoming fleets was tricky, but the Tau scientists and the assistants managed it. As they closed, it got harder and harder to dodge incoming fire, and the shields started soaking up shots, and we all watched the timer until both heretics were in teleportation range carefully. Everyone had their own little nervous reactions as the enemy closed, ranging from Amy repeatedly checking her weapon to Jim and Hannah praying. Sarge took special note the way Tink was hugging his drone like a teddy bear, and how Twitch kept fiddling with the empty nuke case, which he was keeping for quote-unquote sentimental reasons. The Warlock signaled it was time to fall back to the teleporter and personally place the mine on the back of the Tau seat. As he did, he leaned in and told the poor sucker to be careful and stay in his seat so the Eldar ship teleporter could lock onto him. Seriously, Eldars are dicks. Everyone slowly filed out after the Eldar to where the actual teleportation would be happening. Tink, Twitch, and Fumbles brought up the rear. The techie was crying, and Fumbles was radiating waves of misery as well. Sarge carefully ignored them, but the Warlock spared a second to tell them that they were pathetic and asked Fumbles to control his aura. It was making it hard for him to focus on his own powers. Fumbles flipped him off. When the timer hit 0, Twitch activated his time detonators, and Jim did something. The entire ship immediately filled with crackling electricity and a wave of pressure that nearly deafened us. What ported in was horrific. The dreadnought thing we fought down in the lab had nothing on these guys. They were like Sagatari that accompanied the Titan Legions crossed with demons. There was metal, and flesh, and guns, and claws, and way more tentacles than anyone should ever have to see in one place. We all froze for a second. Then before we could fire, the second wave arrived. The Necron's teleporter seemed a little smoother than the Heretics. There wasn't anything lightning or pressure, just a flash of green light. Then the ship was completely packed with metal skeletons, giant clawed metal worm things, and a few thousand scarabs. We all heard a tiny screaming from the Tau. Then the explosives started going off. Everywhere, except for our little 3-meter pad, exploded into violence. There aren't words to properly describe what we saw around us in that ship as we waited for the teleporter to activate. We all held our fire and just stared at the maelstrom around us, trying to pick out what was an actual threat and what wasn't. At first, it looked like everything was just going to ignore us. We were too minor to pay attention to. Then, a single skeleton, taller and fancier looking than the others, stepped right through our barricade and raised a glowing green staff over his head. 3 lasguns, 3 plasma weapons, 2 psionic attacks, and a pair of servo skulls slammed into his face. The Boskron rocked back, and a literal wave of scarabs rushed over him, absorbing our follow-up barrage. Its staff swept downward and was just barely deflected by the Warlock's fancy sword. The Eldar managed to deflect 2 more surprisingly fast blows from the Necron's power staff, while the rest of us poured as much fire in as we could. Then the world went white, and everything around the edges of the platform disappeared. That had been the first teleportation any of us were ever a part of, and honestly, it wasn't nearly as bad as everyone made it out to be. There was no muss, no fuss, no screaming demonic voices accompanying by lightning bolts. Just 1 second here, next second there. There was probably because it was a Xeno teleporter though. Anyways, the first thing we noticed upon arrival was that our maelstrom of violence had been replaced by an equally unsettling army of Eldar. The Boskron looked around for a second, obviously didn't like the odds, then vanished in another flash of green, leaving behind a few dozen scarabs. We very carefully shot these, making sure not to raise our weapons high enough to threaten our nice new hosts. The Warlock breathed a sigh of relief and barked some orders in pointy ear speak. He then turned back and asked us to hand over the detonator and remain on the pad until we reached the teleportation range of an Imperial vessel. Sarge kept his grip on the detonator and suggested that our arrival had damaged the teleporter, possibly in such a way that it could have ported us into the void instead of a vessel. All in all, he preferred to hand over the detonator after a shuttle ride to the Occurrence border. The Eldar muttered something that sounded like, quote, "lucky guess," waved the soldiers away and started leading us through the fancy but confusing corridors of his ship. We rode back in a very familiar-looking shuttle, and spent the majority of the voyage trying to stare down the Wraith Guards and Rangers we ditched in a lab. Thankfully, Sarge was able to keep things to a low simmer, keeping Nummy from saying anything at all, and covering for Tink and Fumbles who were in some sort of depressive feedback loop. There was a scary moment when we got back to comm range in the Occurrence border. Jim and Hannah both seized up and started twitching, causing Tink to break out of his funk and grab his tools. You couldn't quite call it what followed combat surgery, but it was close. Tink ripped something small and metal out of Jim's neck, and then they both went to work on Hannah and extracted something similar. When Sarge asked what the hell happened, Tink said the senior tech priests were rather angry and left as that. After that little show, Sarge put in a call to our adepts and filled them in on the imminent arrival. The bay we touched down in was some sort of racially insensitive standoff, with both the ship's senior tech priests and their servitors staring down the captain and a small army of armsmen. The Warlock looked around, laughed, and told us to have fun. Sarge flipped him off and handed over the detonator, prompting the Warlock to laugh some more. After the guests had left, our little family squabble really got rolling. The tech priests were livid and wanted us dead, and the captain was equally furious that anyone dared to question his authority on his ship. The only thing that kept it from exploding into a bloodbath was the arrival of a sensor tech, reporting that a nuke had gone off and taken a small Heretech cruiser along with the ship. Twitch giggled at that. That wasn't the end of the good news. Apparently the Heretics had decided that they'd settle for an unmodified Necron ship, and were going to the Necron fleet hammer and tongs. From the looks of it, it'd be days before either side had attention enough to spare for us. The captain called that a near total victory as possible, and browbeat the tech priest about how the Archaeotech hadn't fallen into heretical hands, and there'd be time to wait for Juris. None of us knew who Juris was, but Jim said it was a good thing and we accepted being confined to our quarters until he arrived. The first thing we noticed after being escorted to our quarters was a large amount of dead servitors. then the fairly severe structural damage to the hallway. Finally, the note from old Bill saying that we were going to have to clean and repair it ourselves. No one in the engineering department was willing to even walk down this corridor, much less touch anything. They'd even cut a new entry port to the Gellerfield generator from the side corridor. Twitch surveyed the carnage with pride, especially the part where the doors to our quarters were still sealed despite the damage. He supervised the careful opening of one of the doors, while our senior tech priests and servitor escorts stayed at the end of the hallway and glared at everyone. Once it was open, we all piled in, Fumbles and the engine seers included, then sealed the door behind us. After a quick sweep to check for any sort of bugs, the techies confirmed the room was clean and Twitch opened up the nuke case he'd still been carrying. To Sarge's complete lack of surprise, when the lid popped off, a nearly asphyxiated Tau scientist flopped onto the floor, followed by Tink's drone controller. After the little guy had a minute to breathe and get his bearings, he was incredibly grateful. In what Sarge thought was an incredibly annoying voice, he thanked us for the rescue and then asked what he could do to repay us and when we'd return him to the Tau Empire. Everyone kept quiet on the last part, but Tink butted forward. He announced that, for start, the scientist could help him build a new drone. Spot had died for him after all. Then, the techie started to cry again, which set Fumbles off in turn. Nubby led the psyker away to look at pictures of puppies or something, while everyone else went to go find something else less awkward to do, like talk to Jim and Hana about their complex crisis of faith. Well, honestly, talking to Jim and Hana about religion wasn't that awkward. They were a little confused about the stuff they'd seen on the Tauified Necron ship, and now thought senior tech priests were just complete assholes, but that just put them on the same page as the rest of us. Mostly we just sat there and nodded whenever they'd stop talking, then let them sit and think when they ran out of stuff to say. As for the rest of us, we were actually feeling pretty good. We'd completed our mission, and no one except for Amy had gotten shot. Sure, she looked rather odd and completely up to her eyeballs in painkillers, but the Hospitaller probably knew how to regrow hair and would hopefully go to work on her before she came down. Also, as an added bonus, if we managed to keep the Tau scientist alive until we got back to Oak, he'd probably be happy and forget about the whole Necron ship and where it come from. Of course, there was still the little whole thing of the Necrons and the Heretic fleet might stop fighting, turn on us at any second. But there was nothing we could do about that, so we didn't bother worrying about it. Over the next few days, we got regular visits from Doc and the Hospitaller, as well as the Adepts and the Captain. As a basic precaution, the Tau was crammed into one of Twitch's hidey holes during the visits. He complained about the treatment until we explained what the Mechanicus did to mouthy Tau scientists. Anyways, everything was going fairly well, both in space and down on the planet. Battle Axe had successfully captured the planetary governor and galvanized the PDF into a moderately competent defense against the Scarab swarms, and several of the smallest cities and numerous towns had been de-peopled by the evil little bugs, leaving the silhouettes we'd seen on the dead world, but all the major populated centers had been defended. After the Necrons had been engaged by the Heretics, the swarms had stopped porting in, so currently she was just keeping everything stable while the battle in space worked itself out. Up in space, Sword Guy was mostly keeping everyone from doing anything stupid while the Xenos and Heretics mauled each other. Astropathic communication was still down, but reinforcements were still trickling in and brought news of some sort of major fleet force being gathered near the sector capital. If neither hostile fleet disengaged soon, it looked like reinforcements would arrive in time. Finally, the captain said the tech priests were sitting tight and waiting for Juris, who was on the way but had no ETA. Since it seemed like he'd be deciding our fate, we asked Jim and Hana exactly who Juris was. Unfortunately, they went full tech priest on us and only said that he was holy and not something we should ask questions about. We left it as that. Things were crowded enough in our quarters without starting any fights. On the third day of our little incarceration, news came that the Necron fleet had disengaged. They hadn't been defeated by any measure, they just decided that the battle wasn't worth fighting or something. They'd pulled back to the edge of the system, then just vanished, leaving the badly mauled heretic fleet standing there like idiots. The Techs didn't immediately attack us though. Instead, they opted to spend a while licking their wounds and trying to find where the Necrons had gone, or at least that's what it looked like. After a day of waiting, a substantial number of heretic reinforcements came out of the warp, and the whole mess then came closing on the planet. From what the captain had told us later, the battle started about as expected, with the heretics slowly pushing our makeshift fleet back with sheer weight of fire. After half a day of holding actions, our guys had taken a beating and morale nearly broke when a major incoming warp signature had been detected coming in behind the heretic fleet. Thankfully though, instead of more tech reinforcements, it turned out to be a friendly fleet and not a little dinky one. It was an honest to Emperor, or Omnissiah, Explorator fleet, and I shit you not, there was an Arc Mechanicus leading it. It wasn't even a slaughter. That implies that there were pieces left over. It was a complete bloody annihilation. Or at least that's what the captain had told us. We couldn't see it ourselves because some batshit cogboys wouldn't let us out of our quarters. So it wasn't hard to put two and two together and see that this holy Juris guy was probably the reason why there was a Mechanicus fleet here now. Sure enough, word came down that the system was now under his jurisdiction. Everyone was to sit tight while he investigated reports of tech heresy and took corrective measures. This sounded ominous, but since the person who had said it was a bloody arc at his command, we all sat tight. After 2 more days of stewing, stuff started happening. Some fancy-looking test priests we didn't recognize came and asked for Jim and Hannah. Tink and Twitch were in favor of shooting them, or at least telling them to bugger off, but the Agencyr said it was okay. These guys were from the Ordos Juris. We were all sort of torn as Jim and Hannah were let off. They were our mates, and we were worried for them. But on the other hand, the cheeky buggers had let us think that Juris was just some guy's name for something like 2 weeks. Anyways, our cogboy and coggirl were returned without any signs of damage, and the tech heresy investigation continued without touching on us again. The priests never came down to ask us any questions, and they never searched our quarters for Tau scientists or disguised pulse weapons. It was rather worrying at first, since good luck like this tends to be followed by even larger doses of bad, but Jim and Hannah said it made sense. They started to explain that it was some sort of treaty between the Ordos and the Inquisition, but then stopped when they realized that no one but the Tau scientist and Fumbles was actually listening. Speaking of the Tau scientist, we were beginning to regret rescuing him. Quite aside from the risk of being correctively measured by the Ordos Juris, he was incredibly annoying. Theo, as everyone but Tink had called him, was an infuriating combination of neurotic, naive, hyperactive, pedantic, and curious. The fact that no one had strangled him as a child was pretty much proof that Tau civilian worlds really are as non-violent as they claim. Back when he'd been encouraged to talk, Theo spun us a rather odd tale of the whole mess from his perspective. He'd been a technician on a Tau border world and specialized in integrating other races' tech. He'd mostly work on a government lab, but occasionally he'd go out and inspect some passing ship systems. A rogue trader had come in, volunteered for inspection, and had taken him to see a tech priest who had seemed a little strange. Shortly after he looked at the fascinating ship the priest was working on, everything had gone dark. When Theo woke up, his fire warrior guards were gone and he'd been left with a new job. Aside from the kidnapping, the slavery, and the fact that his boss was quite insane even before he had the Jericho augment his brain, the job was quite interesting. They'd stay in their part of the vessel and done what research could while the trader searched for a proper new lab for them. Eventually, the trader found this planet, brokered a favorable arrangement, then went on his way. After what had been much easier to get the parts and tools he needed, but the guards were much more unpleasant. Theo had been getting rather worried that he'd never return to the Tau Empire before we'd show up and rescue him. We all just skirted around that subject. Anyways, the Tau scientist was brilliant and annoying, so it was no surprise that he got well with Tink. What was surprising was that Jim and Hana took to him as well. When they weren't tinkering on Spot 2.0, the four of them would sit around and watch Tau vids that Tink had gotten from somewhere. The rest of us avoided their area like the plague. Our sort of imprisonment finally ended just before any of us got frustrated enough to kill each other. Doc, finally out of the wheelchair, led the relief force with the captain and the other two interrogators and the adepts at his back. They informed us of our freedom and invited us to the main conference room for a final debriefing. We were hesitant at first, but Jim sent a skull to confirm that the combat servitors that had been watching our doors for the last dozen days were actually gone. When we got to the briefing room, it was occupied by a single ordinary-looking tech priest and some guy who looked like a diplomat. Jim and Hana practically fell on themselves, bowing and scraping when they saw the priest, so we figured he was the head Magos Juris, or whatever you call it. The Magos responded by screeching something in binary, prompting the two engineers to look embarrassed, then sit down and shut up. That was the only thing the Magos ever said. Everything else came from the diplomat helper. To start with, there was a presentation of legal documents stating that the entire system was more or less Mechanicus property until they were sure no Necron or Heretic fleet would be returning. Battle Axe and Sword Guy were invited to stay as the official inquisitional observers to the transition of government. Neither interrogator acted surprised, and both accepted, so it was probably fixed beforehand. The Magos' assistant continued on the matter of tech heresy. The system was littered with little fragments of Necron and Heretic ships, but there was no indication of any of the pieces from the modified ship had survived. It was in the Ordo Juris' official standpoint that this was a good thing. From the few scraps of research they'd examined and Jim and Hana's testimony, they were of the opinion that the hybrid Xenotech on the Necron vessel was deeply heretical, and destroying it was the correct response. Our squad was congratulated for its thoroughness, as Jim and Hana for resisting the Xenotech's allure, where so many others had failed. The two engineers literally growled at this. The rest of us tried to maintain our poker faces. Finally, the discussion came around to our ship's tech priesthood. In the Magos' opinion, their actions were not treasonous or heretical, but it had not been ideal. Since our ship's non-ordained engineering staff seemed unusually capable, the entire priesthood was being transferred off-ship for re-education. Jim and Hana would remain as the ship's senior priest, and a tithe of fresh acolytes would be transferred from other ships in the system to fill out the roster until we finished our return voyage. This time, they didn't growl. Hana froze, and Jim looked like he was about to faint. Tink slapped Jim in the back and said he'd be happy to help out. Sarge told him to shut it. With that final little announcement, the Mago Juris left with the other interrogators in tow, and the captain went to see to his ship. This left our team and the stunned engineers with the translator guy. To our surprise, he came over and introduced himself as a Magos as well, despite his apparent lack of metal bits. As he got closer, we all started getting uneasy. To go to the point where something sprang loose and twitched his head, and Sarge had to grab his last pistol before he shot the guy. Now that we saw him up close, he was definitely a tech priest. There's normal looking, and then there's aggressively normal looking. This guy looked like someone had sculpted every inch of his body to exactly average human specification. It was amazingly creepy. Anywho, The creepy Diplomago went to where Jim and Hannah were still silently freaking out and assured them that they'd do fine. The Inquisition was the perfect place for them. Both of them should embrace it and take the chance to watch, learn, and grow because they need every scrap of experience. See, here, where the service of the Inquisition ended, they were going to sit in some manufactorum for the rest of their days. Jim and Hannah had been marked for something greater. They'd be joining the Ordo Juris. This news did absolutely nothing to reduce the Engineer's panic level, and the Diplomagos let out a very unsettling laugh as he turned to the rest of us. He handed Sarge a data slate and informed us that their ship had a more efficient method of communications than astropaths. The Diplomagos had informed our Inquisitor of the situation and its findings. Oak had sent this in reply. Of course, the Ordo Juris would never read the Inquisition's private communications, but he suspected our Inquisitor had an interesting little task for us to perform on our return trip. Sarge pocketed the slate without comment and tried to stare down someone who apparently never blinked. In an effort to save Sarge, Doc stepped in and asked the Magos if the Ordos would be taking over the pursuit of the rogue trader who sold the Necron ship. The tech priest turned his unsettling gaze to Doc for a while, then said that in this matter the Ordo Juris only had interest in those who committed or ordered the commission of Tech Heresy. Everyone who worked for the heretical project was already dead, primarily by our hands, and the entirety of the planet's nobility was being examined for degree of guilt. Currently, they were not concerned with the rogue trader being rogue traders, though whoever initially provided them with the Necron vessel would be of interest, or would be if the Inquisition had already claimed jurisdiction over the matter, that is. Doc decided that he didn't want to talk to the scary Magos anymore. Everyone clammed up and avoided eye contact in hope that the Juris would just get the hint and leave. Smiling that creepy smile, the Diplomagos told us unless we were incredibly unlucky, we'd never encounter him or the Ordo Juris again, but they would be watching with great interest. On that unsettling note, he wished us good luck and good hunting, then left. Twitch muttered something about the Mechanicus being full of weirdos. The rest of us, including Jim and Hannah, agreed. Nubby suggested that this was probably a good time to go get a drink, possibly in the mess hall where the betting pool was scheduled to finally be concluded in about 20 minutes. No one questioned how he managed to know this despite being locked up in the same quarters as the rest of us. The mess was, of course, packed. Nearly everyone had been in the betting pool, and even if they hadn't won, they wanted to see who did or if their stakes would be refunded. Fumbles, the adepts, and tech priests took one look at the press of bodies and decided it wasn't worth it. But us dowdy guardsmen couldn't be deterred so easily, and made heavy use of our feet and elbows to carve a path. Nubby and, surprisingly, Amy were the most vicious about it, and managed to get all the way to the table the quartermaster was standing on. Surprisingly, he was backed up by the captain and some heavily armed armsmen. Upon seeing us, the quartermaster visibly flinched and hefted his lockbox and ledger like some sort of shield. The captain prodded him, then bellowed for silence. It took the quartermaster a few tries to get started, but eventually he listed off the agreed-upon rules of the pool. He then began going down the number and size of the bets on each of the categories until he finally reached the winning one. In a quavering voice, he announced that most of the people who had bet on the xenospecies known as the Necrons had been allowed to withdraw their bets due to extenuating circumstances. Nubby grinned hugely, then registered the word most. It turned out that the only bet remaining in the category was a wager of 20 thrones by Amelia de Loresista Amanita Tristrata Zendana Amalfi von Humpington. Amy screamed in triumph. Nubby frothed and raged and had to be restrained by Sergeant Twitch. The rest of the room either exploded into laughter or started muttering about things being rigged. Then the captain bellowed for silence again, and the quartermaster resumed speaking. Unfortunately, he said, since the winning bet was placed by a latecomer and therefore was made with an unfair amount of knowledge, the ship's senior officers had decreed that the payout would be limited to a factor of 100 to 1. The remainder would be forfeit into a special budget to be distributed for the good of the entire vessel, as decreed by its most honorable and wise captain. Amy cursed a blue streak, and Nubby took turn raucously laughing. The rest of the room dissolved into even more angry muttering. Finally, Captain stepped into the center stage and announced that, for the good of the vessel, the first use of the budget would be to supply this mess with unlimited rations of sakura for the remainder of the evening. This was met with much more enthusiasm. As the party erupted around us, and Amy and Nubby screamed at each other and the poor quartermaster, Sarge finally got around to reading Oak's message. Unsurprisingly, it was a new assignment to be performed before returning. He read the orders, swore, then flagged down the captain, who swore even harder. Both men decided they needed somewhere more quiet to think things over and headed up to the bridge. As they left, Doc flagged them down and asked what was going on. He was shown the first line of Oak's orders, which read,
The Emperor's Scythe Space Marine chapter has agreed to undertake the capture of a living Tyranid Xanthrope for study. You are to assist them in this mission in any way possible and handle the transport of the creature to my laboratories.